Good day. Today is Monday, 24th March 2025, and over the last couple of hours, the United States and Russia, their various expert teams, have been meeting in Riyadh, and the discussions between them have been taking place. And according to Donald Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, and Ushakov, Putin's presidential aide, the purpose of the discussions is to try to re-establish the grain deal that used to provide for the unrestricted traffic of commercial ships in the Black Sea, specifically ships shipping Ukrainian foodstuffs to various countries around the world. And as I said, those discussions are underway. Now, I discussed these discussions at some length yesterday. I discussed the interesting makeup of the delegations. The American and Russian delegations, both headed by officials, what one might call middle rank officials, people very far from the top positions in the American and Russian governments, people who could perhaps be legitimately described as experts, officials of the U.S. National Security Council and the State Department in the case of the United States, a former diplomat and parliamentarian, Grigory Krasin, in the case of Russia, as well as an intelligence, an individual, an official with a background in security and intelligence, Sergei Besieda, in the case of the Russians. The Ukrainian delegation, as I discussed in my program yesterday, is completely different. It's headed by Ukraine's defense minister, Rustem Umerov. In other words, a figure of cabinet rank and a political figure. And it comes with a large staff, a large group of presidential aides and military officials who are there apparently also to participate in the discussions. And I discussed yesterday how whilst the Americans and the Russians appear to be focusing on trying to revive the grain deal in the Black Sea, it's clear that the Ukrainians have a much more ambitious agenda. They want to expand the various ceasefires. They want to move, apparently, towards the Macron plan of a complete ceasefire in the air and by sea, a plan which the Russians have rejected, a plan which the Russians see as a pathway to creating a Western policed no-fly zone over Western Ukraine, something which the Russians are strongly opposed to. Well, I said that I thought more likely than not the Americans and the Russians would disagree with would oppose what the Ukrainians were trying to do. They would move forward with the substantive discussions about reviving the Black Sea grain deal, and the Americans no doubt would listen to what the Ukrainians had to say, but they were unlikely to agree with it. And the American officials, Michael Anton, and headed by Michael Anton, were unlikely to agree to these proposals. Well, I understand that yesterday the Americans and the Ukrainians did actually meet, but reports suggest that the meeting lasted all of 40 minutes. If this is correct, then it is impossible that anything of substance was really discussed over the course of that discussion. It seems to be more likely that the purpose of the meeting in that case was for the Americans to make clear to the Ukrainians the very restricted nature of the discussions that were going to take place with the Russians, and to make clear to the Ukrainians that the discussions would be specifically about the grain deal, perhaps also to some extent about the agreed ceasefire on attacks against the energy system, but that any decision to expand or extend the ceasefire would require agreement with the political leaders, Trump and Putin, and that the officials meeting in Saudi Arabia from Russia and the United States do not have the authority to agree to extend the ceasefire in that way. So supposedly a 40-minute meeting, and the Ukrainians came out of the meeting, and apparently their head of mission, Umarov, said that the discussion had gone well, but that he would not disclose any details, and in fact the Ukrainians have disclosed no details at all about the nature of their substantive discussions with the Americans. The Americans apparently did tell the Ukrainians to stay, and the Ukrainian mission is still in Riyadh, presumably in the same hotel building, the Ritz-Carlton, a building which, by the way, some years ago achieved a brief notoriety when Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman did indeed become Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia after the accession of his father, King Salman. He arranged for the arrest of various highly connected Saudi princes as part of I would call it a purge of the senior ranks of the Saudi princely hierarchy. Several of these princes were held in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. There were reports at the time that some of them had been put through some kind of shakedown and had to give up some of their assets. Anyway, it is a building, a hotel, which has an interesting history behind it and perhaps many tales to tell. Anyway, the Ukrainians are still there, presumably in one of the rooms in the building, even as the Russians and the Americans are meeting in a different room. And one assumes that every so often people from the American delegation go to the Ukrainians, contact the Ukrainians, tell them a little about what is happening in the discussions with the Russians, trying to see what the Ukrainians think about those discussions and what the Ukrainians have to say. And, anyway, it's clear, nonetheless, that the key discussions are taking place between the Russians and the Americans. Now, I've discussed before how situations where the two parties in a conflict are in separate rooms in a single building, and a mediator moves between these two rooms, passing ideas from one to the other. That is a classic mediation exercise, such as I have been involved in many times. This doesn't sound like a mediation exercise. It sounds like the Americans and the Russians negotiating with each other, but the Americans keeping the Ukrainians informed. And I've said previously that the fact that the United States is by its own admission, a party to the conflict, which it has itself acknowledged is a proxy conflict between the United States and Russia, effectively precludes the United States from fulfilling the classical role of a mediator, which requires total impartiality between the parties. Anyway, The meetings between the Americans and the Russians are still ongoing. They have been ongoing for several hours. There was a break, and the head of the Russian delegation, Grigory Karasin, is reported by Interfax, unofficial Russian news agency, to have said this: the negotiations between Russia and the US in Riyadh are proceeding creatively with interesting discussions of topical issues taking place. According to Karasin, the parties are managing to maintain contact and understand each other's point of view. Now, that is a very interesting and, if I can say, diplomatic form of words. It suggests that there's been no breakthrough or agreement for the moment about the Black Sea grain deal or anything else. There's still interesting discussions of topical issues taking place. Interesting suggests that the Russians have been presented with various ideas by the Americans, but then perhaps somewhat skeptical of these ideas. I mean, interesting suggests that they're unusual, but perhaps not exactly the kind of ideas that the Russians would accept. If that were the case, if they were being presented with ideas that they liked, they would perhaps, Karasin perhaps, would use rather more, shall we say, favourable terms. He might say that they were welcome discussions of topical issues as opposed to interesting discussions of topical issues. And when Karasin also says that the parties are managing to maintain contact and understand each other's point of view, well, that takes us back into the well-known territory of a frank and full exchange of views, which, as I've said previously in previous programs, points less towards a consensus being reached, less towards an actual agreement, and more towards a contentious discussion, with one side putting forward interesting ideas, which the other side then rejects, perhaps putting forward equally interesting ideas of its own. Now, none of this should come as any sort of surprise. It seems to me that it would be unrealistic to expect breakthroughs on any single topic so quickly. It would probably require much more than just one meeting. And one wonders how long this big, high-powered Ukrainian delegation can afford to remain in Riyadh, even as these discussions between the Americans and the Russians get underway. In Moscow, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has actually said that one should not expect things to move forward particularly fast. The TASS dispatch says the following: Kremlin sees much work ahead for Russia, US towards resolving Ukraine crisis. And TASS then goes on to say that Peskov said the following, its report says the following: while both Moscow and Washington are willing to resolve the situation in Ukraine, much work on technical issues lies in store. When asked to comment on statements from US President Donald Trump regarding the contours of a peace deal, Peskov said, the two sides are clearly willing to move towards peace. Notice, again, careful choice of words. He doesn't say that the two sides are clearly moving towards peace. They're willing to move towards peace. In other words, they both want a peace agreement, but they haven't yet worked out how to get there. And he then goes on to say, and they share a common understanding here, indeed. In other words, they both want peace, but as I said, that they haven't yet found a pathway to reach it. And then Peskov is also quoted as saying, in general, lots and lots of aspects of the peace process will certainly have to be addressed. In other words, there's a long way to go. There's a great deal to discuss. It's unrealistic to expect that a single meeting is going to be able to resolve all issues, or even issues on a discrete question like the restoration of the Black Sea grain deal. So, discussions underway, and I'm going to say that some people are in the West, not just in Ukraine, are already becoming nervous about the potential restoration of the grain grain deal. It says, for example, there's an article about this in the Financial Times. It says that EU littoral states, Romania and Bulgaria, are wary of any significant changes to the status quo in the Black Sea as part of a broader potential agreement between Russia and the US. Officials from the region told the Financial Times, given that it would expand the Russian Navy's operational area. And then the Financial Times goes on to say, this Ukraine has successfully driven Russia's Navy out of the western part of the sea, which is completely not the case. By the way, as I've discussed in many places, Russia has submarines which are perfectly capable and do operate in the western part of the Black Sea, and Russian aircraft conduct regular patrols over it, and sometimes, as I understand it, Russian surface ships enter the western part of the Black Sea as well. But then it goes on to say, the Financial Times article goes on to say, any agreement negotiated is thus expected to be beneficial to Moscow, the officials said. These are Romanian and Bulgarian officials, and could affect their country's security without giving them a say. This is our neighbourhood, and we don't trust the Russians if they're allowed more freedom to operate, said one of the officials. Now, what is being hinted about here is that, of course, the original grain deal negotiated back in the summer of 2022 envisaged inspections of commercial shipping in the Black Sea, heading to and from Ukrainian Black Sea ports to ensure that there would be no transfer of military equipment via that shipping. The Russians came to the conclusion that this part of the agreement was not being honoured. From memory, my recollection is that it was Turkey that was supposed to conduct the inspections. It was Erdogan who brokered the original Black Sea grain deal. The Russians complained that Erdogan wasn't doing his job properly, which, by the way, is no surprise. And that was one of the reasons, though not the only reason, why the Russians pulled out of the grain deal. Now, presumably, if the grain deal is reinstated, the Russians will want far more intrusive inspections. And there's been some suggestions that the Americans, alongside the Russians, might conduct some of these inspections, though that would require the Russians to agree to some kind of American naval presence in the Black Sea, which the Russians might not be willing to do. Though who knows, it might be that Coast Guard ships, some of the lighter ships of the US armed forces might be allowed in, patrol boats and those kind of things. I'm not going to discuss this further, but it's quite plausible that the Russians will say that the only real way of ensuring that the inspections are carried out properly is if Russia in fact conducts or at least participates in those inspections, which is something that obviously the Ukrainians won't like, and the Romanians and the Bulgarians won't like, because much of this commercial shipping moves close to the Romanian and Bulgarian coast, and it would indeed mean, if the Russians were conducting inspections, that their warships would be operating just off the Bulgarian and Romanian coasts on a regular basis, and without presumably the threat of attack by Ukraine. So, just saying. Anyway, it's a contentious topic. We'll see where it goes. We'll see whether anything is indeed agreed over the course of this. But going back to Peskov, he said that this is going to be a complex and difficult process. We shouldn't be in a hurry to expect agreements, even something as relatively, well, I don't know whether it's exactly straightforward, but a topic which perhaps is not as complicated as some of the others, like reviving the Black Sea grain deal, involves working through serious technical issues, and realistically it may take more than one meeting, and that is what Peskov has said. The political will to reach an agreement is there, but that doesn't mean that these many issues, these many contentious issues, aren't there also, and they will have to be worked through and solved. Now, before I proceed, I do want to say a little bit more about the Russian delegation and the people who are heading it. And it's about the second senior, or at least the second official alongside Karasin, who is participating in this negotiation on behalf of the Russians, and that is Sergei Besieda. Now, when I mentioned his name yesterday, I thought that his name was somehow familiar. And then, of course, I went back and I checked out who he was. This is after the program was made, and it all came back to me. Now, Besieda was indeed, for many years, a senior official of the FSB. This is one of Russia's most important agencies, the agency that emerged out of the KGB, that took over many of the KGB's former functions in terms of internal security within Russia itself, and which is involved in counter-espionage and those sort of things. And Besieda was a head of department within the FSB. He was a very senior official within the FSB, having, I believe, previously served as an official within the Soviet KGB itself. Now, Besieda was, for a time, before the Maidan events, a point of contact between Ukraine's own internal security agencies and Russian intelligence and counterintelligence. And famously or notoriously, he was physically present in Kiev at the time when the Maidan coup took place in February 2014. There's been much speculation about what he was doing there. There are claims from the Russian side that he was there to try to ensure protection for Russia's embassy. But there have been many suggestions that he was there to try to organize something altogether more sinister or nefarious, like a crackdown by the Ukrainian security agencies, which were at that time answerable to the pre-Maidan president, Viktor Yanukovych, to organize a crackdown against the Maidan protests that were taking place on Maidan Square. That has never been proved. Anyway, that has always made him a controversial figure in Ukraine. In fact, in some places, even a hated figure amongst some people in Ukraine. Now, in February, March 2022, a series of reports appeared, including from a Russian journalist called Soldatov, and which appeared in a newspaper, Moscow Times, which at that time was published in Moscow, but which is published in English and which was Western owned. It still exists, by the way, and is still published, though it is now based outside Russia. Anyway, there were reports that shortly after the start of the special military operation, Besieda had been sacked and arrested and was held in Russia's Lefortovo prison. This is one of the grimmest and toughest prisons in Moscow, going all the way back to the time of Peter the Great, and it had a particularly dark history during the period of Stalin's terror. Anyway, that he was being held there and that he was being blamed by Putin for providing false reports about the internal situation in Ukraine, and in particular for leading Putin and other senior Russian officials to believe that if the Russian army entered Ukraine, Ukraine would immediately collapse, and that many officials of the Ukrainian leadership, including regional officials in eastern Ukraine, would immediately defect to the Russian side. There were lots of reports about this. There were reports that 150 FSB officers had been sacked and arrested, and that Besieda himself had been sacked and arrested and was held in prison under tough interrogation. And I remember that it was talked about and discussed at huge length, and it was very much part of the narrative that was created then and which has persisted ever since, that the Russians were taken aback by the intensity of Ukrainian resistance and that they'd expected to capture Kiev within 3 days, and that this is all based on false information, false intelligence, and that the Russian plans went disastrously wrong. Now, amazingly, even though Besieda has now turned up as one of the leading negotiators in Riyadh, leading Russian negotiators in Riyadh, that story is still circulating. I've read reports in Newsweek and the Daily Telegraph, which still repeat the claims about what happened or allegedly happened to Besieda in 2014, and all the stories about the purge within Russia, the intelligence agencies, about the sacking of 150 officials, about Besieda's arrest and detention, and all of that. This is despite the fact that by August 2014, as the Washington Post reported, US intelligence had established that Besieda, far from being arrested, was still in post, heading the same department in the FSB. And shortly after that, or some time after that, Kirill Budanov, no less, the Ukrainian intelligence chief, also came out and said that, as far as he was aware, Besieda was still in good standing with the Russian authorities and with the FSB, and that he was still head of his own department. And in fact, Besieda finally retired from the FSB in the summer of last year and was immediately appointed an advisor to the head of the FSB, Bortnikov, who is a close associate and political ally of Vladimir Putin's. So, an old narrative, an old story about Besieda, clearly untrue, though, as I said, you still find it being repeated by people who want to cling to it. I only mention all of this because, to repeat again, Russia is a country whose government keeps its secrets very, very well. And you constantly have this problem of rumours and stories, claims about things that go on inside the Kremlin or in various parts of the Russian government. You have endless tales of power struggles and all of that. And far more often than not, there is no reality to them. In the case of the story about Besieda's downfall in March 2014 and his arrest and the arrest of the other intelligence officials, as I've said, it provided a major prop to the story about Russia expecting to capture Kiev within 3 days. There's no truth to that claim either, just saying. Putin actually announced a ceasefire, unilateral ceasefire on the second day, which, as I said, makes the whole story a nonsense. But anyway, but people, as we've seen with Besieda, they won't give up these stories, even when they're proved to be untrue. And that makes it very difficult, very often, to get a sense of what is happening. Now, I'm going to say, despite the fact that Karasin is the head of the mission, Besieda, who is clearly something of a Ukraine specialist, is probably playing perhaps the key role, just saying. He clearly knows Ukraine very well, which is why the Ukrainians dislike him. And he is an expert in the sense that he's expert on the way in which Ukraine conducts itself and the sort of things that it does, and its propensity, Ukraine's propensity to break ceasefires. Now, I mentioned the last because the Russians are again complaining this morning that the Ukrainians are violating the energy ceasefire. The ceasefire on attacks on the energy system. And the Russians are saying that another energy facility in Kuban has just been attacked by Ukraine again, and that this is a clear breach this time of the ceasefire. What appears to have happened is that a Ukrainian drone was detected, at least what the Russians say, is that a Ukrainian drone was detected by Russia's air defense system heading towards this major oil facility. It was shot down before it reached it, but this is proof, or further proof, that Ukraine simply cannot be trusted, that it continues to violate the terms of the energy, the truce on energy attacks. And, well, the Russians are also saying that the Ukrainians carried out this attack even whilst the negotiations in Riyadh were underway, And they did that with the obvious intention of undermining the process of those negotiations. So that's what the Russians are saying. And there's quite a lengthy discussion of this. TASS has given an account. Kiev attacked the Caspian Pipeline Consortium's largest oil pumping station, Kropotkinskaya, located in Krasnodar region, at 2 a.m. on March 24th, which is today, 2 a.m. local time. Russian air defenses intercepted a Ukrainian drone 7 kilometers from the facility. Its fragments fell near the Kavkazskaya railway station. And despite what Zelensky says, Ukraine continues to deliberately attack energy infrastructure, including international, on Russian territory, the Defense Ministry added. And, well, to repeat again, yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry said that if Ukraine continues to violate the truce in this fashion, Russia reserves the right to conduct symmetrical measures. We issue a clear warning. If the Kiev regime persists in its destructive course, Russia reserves the right to respond, including with symmetrical measures. Now, of course, there will be many people who will say that the Ukrainians haven't violated the ceasefire. Either this attack didn't take place at all, or it is a Russian false flag. I'm going to say straight away that I think this is most unlikely. I think that probably the Ukrainians did conduct this attack. They are not happy with the existing ceasefire. They want to extend it in the way that I said, in order to create a no-fly zone over western Ukraine. If they can provoke the Russians into these kind of symmetrical measures, causing the collapse of the ceasefire, they will say that it is the Russians who have broken the ceasefire and not themselves, and they will try to persuade the Americans to shift onto their side. Besieda's job, clearly, in the ongoing negotiations in Riyadh, is to say to the Americans, look, I know all about this. I know the Ukrainians very well. I've seen what they do. I see how they appear to agree one thing one day and go ahead and do the opposite the next day. Their word cannot be trusted. They are clearly the people who are behind these attacks, and I can provide you with all of the information you need on all of these previous episodes because, well, I was monitoring them. It was my job to see how it was all done. Just saying. So anyway, that's the situation at the moment with the talks. We shouldn't expect anything quickly. The talks are, however, ongoing. Now, that then brings us back to the topic of the talks and what the Russian objectives are and what ultimately the contours of a settlement might be. Now, as it happens, I've now been able to obtain a information about the actual article. I've actually read the original article by Andrei Kolesnikov in Kommersant, the one where Putin met with the industrialists on the 18th of March, just before his conversation with Trump, and the one in which he apparently told the industrialists that Russia was going to stick to its demand that the four regions be transferred in their entirety to Russia. And, well, it's a very long article, much of it very discursive, as Russian newspaper articles often are, giving descriptions of the meeting between of the meeting of the industrialists at the various parts that different people were playing. But then it does eventually get to this discussion which took place. And this is what it says, and I'm taking this now from a machine translation, which I'm slightly, amending myself. In the closed part of the meeting, some of its participants told me, so Kolesnikov was briefed by the participants. He wasn't himself present, but he was briefed almost immediately. Kolesnikov himself having participated in all of the rest of the meeting. Anyway, in the closed part of the meeting, Vladimir Putin did not talk to the business people about business. He said that for this purpose, he was leaving them with the deputy head of the administration, Maxim Oreshkin, with whom all issues of interaction could be resolved. He spoke to the elected delegates of the convention about what he had apparently been thinking about all this time, preparing for his conversation with Trump. The conversation, as we know, took place later. So Putin briefed the industrialists and the entrepreneurs about what he was going to say to Trump shortly after, when he finally spoke to Trump over the phone. And we're then told that Putin had always wanted to avoid bloodshed in terms of ending the conflict in Ukraine. And he said that initially the entire issue had been about Crimea. This was in early 2014. Then it became clear that the Ukrainians and the Western powers were not prepared to listen, and that then escalated into a conflict in the Donbass, and then it became the issue became the autonomy of the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics. However, again, that didn't result in any result. Obviously, there was the Minsk agreement, which was negotiated, but it was never implemented. And then Putin said that finally, this is, as I said, a machine translation, finally it came to a question of recognizing them, that is to say Lugansk and Donetsk republics, as well as Kherson and Zaporozhye regions, as part of Russia. And the article goes on to say at the further point at which Russia could be stopped, was pushed back, the less chance there was to reach an agreement. So the longer Ukraine delays, in other words, in coming to an agreement, the more Russian demands are going to grow because of changes of the situation on the ground, and eventually the point would be reached when there would be no point in coming to any sort of agreement at all. And in the end, it would turn out that it could no longer be stopped at all. And we're very close to that point. They don't have time to dig in, said Putin. And perhaps this formula was inspired by a conversation he had a day before with Defense Minister Belousov, who he met, it's no secret, on the latter's birthday. That is March 17th. In other words, Kolesnikov is assuming that Belousov briefed Putin about Russia's military plans over the course of the next few weeks, over the course of a meeting that Belousov and Putin had with each other on the 17th of March, on the occasion of Belousov's birthday. And we're then told that it all came together, and the starting point is that what Russia has achieved cannot be taken away, and the Crimea, Sevastopol, and the 4 known territories should be recognized as part of Russia. Lugansk and Donetsk republics, the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. If this happens in the near future, Russia, Kolesnikov says, the participants in the meeting told him, Russia will not lay claim to Odessa and other territories which currently belong to Ukraine. But this point may also shift because, and this is again a quote from Putin, they don't have time to dig in. And the article by Kolesnikov then goes on to say that the participants of the meeting noted the same thing. Putin believes that it is possible to come to an agreement with Trump, and in general, he actually trusts Trump, but we see that he's nonetheless taking a very tough line. Now, the article is very idiomatic, and as I said, you can perhaps translate it in slightly different ways, but this is my own understanding of what Kolesnikov was told by the participants of the meeting with Putin. Now, this does not absolutely categorically say that Putin insisted that the entire territory of the 4 regions must be transferred to Russia. But it very strongly implies it. It would be very strange if that was not the intention. And I understand that Russian regional media, which I do not have access to, is saying the same thing. Now, there's been no comment from the Kremlin itself saying that this report from Kolesnikov is wrong in any fundamental way. Now, I've received some pushback from this from various people, including people that I have immense respect for and who I am quite convinced believe that Russia absolutely does want peace and America wants peace, and that holding to a demand for the transfer of the 4 regions is an impossible demand for the Russians to make, that it would be a deal breaker, that it would result in a complete collapse of the negotiations. And, well, I've had several people write to me explaining why they think this cannot be true and setting out their reasons, often very cogently. But I have to say straight away, reading all of these comments, it's important to say that what the people who are writing them to me are doing is they're saying what they think Putin should do, not what Putin and the Russians will do. Because, of course, we're not briefed directly about what the Russians say or think on any of these questions. And I've read some of the reasons and explanations why it suggested that this would be an unreasonable and excessive demand. And I wonder whether Putin himself sees things in quite that way. For Putin, and for many people in Russia, maybe not a majority of people, but it's important to stress again, people who form Putin's core constituency. Giving up a Russian claim to Odessa, for example, would be an extremely difficult thing to do. And there will be much criticism of Putin if that is the eventual outcome of a peace agreement, even if arrangements are made to grant Odessa autonomy and to ensure its protection as a Russian city and all of that. In fact, there will be people who will be furious about this. They may perhaps be 10, 20% in the opinion polls, but that doesn't, I think, reflect their political importance. The fact that they're likely to be strongly represented within the intelligence and security and defense elite, and they're quite likely to be represented also to have their representatives in the Kremlin as well. Indeed, I'm going to say straight away that I strongly suspect that there are people within the Russian Security Council who would not be happy if this conflict ended without Odessa being returned to the motherland. So Putin's political space may not be quite as great as some people say or think. And I've read also a lot of comments about how pressing on for the complete conquest, if you like, of the entirety of the four regions, rejecting a ceasefire if that means that the remaining territory of the four regions, which is still under Ukrainian control, remains Ukrainian, is not going to play well with some of Russia's allies, China, India, Brazil, for example. I think that was certainly true, say, a year or more ago. But I'm going to say this, I think that by now, matters have moved on an awful lot. We've had that meeting in Kazan. All sorts of arrangements have been made to move forward with the BRICS. The Russians have explained their position to all of their various different allies extensively. And some of these allies, China, for example, now has to contend with the issue, the presence of Donald Trump in the White House, and they show signs, therefore, of valuing their relationship with Russia even more. I don't think that the Russians are worried anymore that their allies will turn on them if they hold out for the four regions. This has been a Russian position for some time. It has been explained at great length. I think by now Russia's allies or friends, BRICS friends, have probably mostly accepted this and have come round. They will probably say to themselves that if we reach this point when the Russians aren't prepared to give up the entire four regions, their claim to the entirety of the four regions, then, well, it's the fact that the US and the Western powers and the Ukrainians dug in for so long that has brought us to this point. And if their advice had been heeded earlier to begin negotiations with the Russians sooner, we would never have come to this pass. And the last point is that not a single one of these comments that I've received addresses the issue of the Russian constitution. Now, whenever the topic of the Russian constitution comes up, one gets the sense that eyes roll. People say this cannot really be such a big issue, that the Russians don't take the constitution all that seriously, that Putin can't possibly take the constitution of Russia all that seriously. Well, that may be so, but again, does Putin himself think in that way? After all, his legal power is based on the constitution. He's been extremely careful, always in the various things he's done, to follow the letter of the constitution, even if he goes against its spirit. For example, in giving himself more terms as Russia's president, he's always been very careful to get constitutional amendments passed before he does that. Is he really quite as indifferent to this as some of these commentators, some of these people who've been writing to me, assume? Bear in mind, there are also international implications here. For example, if the Russians give ground on the 4 regions, if they say that, well, we're not prepared to take control of all of the 4 regions, we're prepared to concede that Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and Pokrovsk and Zaporozhye can all remain, and Kherson, all of these cities can all remain Ukrainian. Constitution here isn't such a problem. Maybe we can just pass another constitutional amendment to change that. That might have wider implications on other things. For example, Russia has been involved in a long-standing dispute with Japan over the status of the Kuril Islands. The Japanese continue to insist that the Kuril Islands belong to them, and they demand the transfer of the Kuril Islands to themselves as a condition of a peace treaty between Japan and Russia. Now, the Russians have consistently pushed back against this, and one of the reasons they say that they cannot do this is because the Kuril Islands are part of Russia, and the Russian constitution prohibits concessions on this question over the Kuril Islands to Japan. But if Russia makes such concessions over the status of the 4 regions, might not the Japanese come back and say, well, just a moment, the constitution isn't really quite as important to you as you say. Maybe if you're prepared to give up your claims to what you used to say was Russian territory in your conflict with Ukraine, maybe you can do the same with us. Now, the Russians do want to hold on to the Kuril Islands because, of course, the Kuril Islands are, as Putin has pointed out, the gateway to the Sea of Okhotsk in the Far East, where Russian Navy submarines with intercontinental ballistic missiles conduct their patrols. So the Russians do not want to give up the Kuril Islands. Would they be prepared to weaken their diplomatic position with Japan by making concessions over the status of the 4 regions to Ukraine? Just saying. What about other issues where the Russian constitution is in play? Britain, for example, has repeatedly demanded the extradition by Russia of Russian citizens to Britain who Britain says have committed crimes in Britain. The Russians have consistently said that they are not able to do that, because their constitution prohibits it. But if the Russians are prepared to bend or change or be flexible about their constitution with respect to the four regions, how does that argument stand? Now, are these compelling points? Is it something that is at the forefront of Putin's mind? Will he say, I cannot make these concessions because if I do, it will put me in a difficult position with Britain and Japan? I don't know, and I don't think anybody does, but I think it's a possibility that people need to keep in mind. Putin may feel that the Russian constitution is not something he can afford to bargain over in quite the way that some people would like to believe. I have to say that many of these proposals, many of these suggestions about Russia making these kind of concessions look very rational from the perspective of an outsider, very keen to end the war, very keen to repair relations between Russia and the West. But from a Russian perspective, it may not seem quite that way. I'll give one further example from one particular paper that somebody that I have a exceptionally special respect for. A particular point this person made. He said that Russian lives matter, that capturing a city like Zaporozhye is going to involve thousands more Russian lives. Is Putin really prepared to sacrifice those Russian lives to achieve the conquest of these places? And I'm absolutely sure that is a concern that Putin himself does indeed have in mind. But then I can again see the counter-argument from, say, someone like Medvedev. And I don't know, again, what Medvedev himself will think about all of this and what he will say. But I can imagine him coming back and saying to Putin, yes, Russian lives do indeed matter. What about the lives of those Russians in Zaporozhye, Kherson, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Pokrovsk? Are you prepared to abandon them to Ukraine, just as you seem to be willing to abandon those Russians in Odessa? Again, I don't know whether these kind of discussions are taking place inside the Kremlin, but I have to say I would not be at all surprised if they are. Anyway, I'm not going to say any more about this. For the moment, it seems to me that the Russian position remains quite clear, that they are not prepared to give up a millimetre of their claims to the four regions. That is how I read the Kommersant article. Some of the articles, apparently, in the Russian regional media go much further than this, but I haven't read those articles. Go back also to what Putin said to the participants in this meeting of the industrialists. Compare it to the many things that Lavrov has also said. The longer Ukraine holds out, the less reasonable it is in negotiations. Lavrov has said this many times. The more territory it loses. Russia now says it will settle for the four regions of Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. Yes, Ukraine can refuse to agree to that. Yes, it can defend Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. But when the Russians eventually capture all of these places, which they will, then the situation will change. And at that point, the Russians may say, the 4 regions are not enough. We must have more of what was formerly Russian land, lived in by Russian people who speak Russian, practice the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox faith, are by culture Russian and want to return to the motherland. And then, if claims for Odessa, Kharkiv, and all of these places come, what then? Much better, I would have thought, not to get to that point, at least from a Ukrainian point of view and a Western point of view. Much better not to test that proposition and to try to move towards a negotiated settlement now, one which almost certainly, in fact definitely, given the realities on the battlefronts, is one that is going to have to be decided largely on Russian terms. There is a good article in Al Jazeera about this, I think by a Russian journalist, as it happens, but it says Putin may well get what he wants in Ukraine, and I think that is probably true. And the point Leonid Rogozin is making is that the dynamics of the conflict now point increasingly to that outcome. And coming back to that interview that Steve Witkoff gave to Tucker Carlson, I think some people in the United States, in the administration, Witkoff himself, probably Donald Trump, understand that very well. Yes, it is going to be very difficult for Donald Trump to arrive at that destination point. He will be criticized if that point of conceding the entire territory of the 4 regions come. Certainly, I don't think he can do that within the next couple of days or weeks, which is why I personally think a complete ceasefire in that time is unlikely. If I have to guess when I think the ceasefire is more likely to come, I'm going to suggest the late summer or early autumn, once there have been more Russian advances, once perhaps places like Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk and places like that fall under Russian control, once the Russians reach the Dnieper River close to Zaporozhye, which they're quite likely to do. Ukrainian defenses in this area look very ragged, and it may be very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold their positions there, by the way, anywhere else on the combat line, but perhaps especially there for very long. At that point, a Russian demand for the transfer of the 4 regions in their entirety to Russia, which so many people are balking at the moment, might not seem so difficult to concede. And at that point, for all we know, that is the point that it will come, and when we will have the framework agreement and the ceasefire, bringing at least the violent part of the conflict to an end. Though I am going to say that I think the broader Ukrainian crisis probably will not end. Gordon Hahn, the American analyst, has written a fine piece saying how if we ever reach that kind of outcome, a military uprising in Ukraine against the political leadership has a high probability. There may also be a backlash of a different kind entirely in places like Odessa. It may not be the end completely of the whole conflict. If there is a change of government in Kiev towards a more radical direction, then it's not impossible that the conflict at that point could restart. But then Donald Trump and his administration will probably have achieved their objectives, which is to wash their hands of the whole affair. My own view is that the conflict the previous conflict which resembles this one most is not the Korean conflict, which many people talk about, but the conflict in Vietnam. That conflict ended with a peace agreement between the United States and North Vietnam, bitterly resented and indeed rejected by South Vietnam. That conflict essentially conceded the major demands made over the course of the North negotiations by the North Vietnamese. Once the peace agreement was signed, and once the Americans had pulled out, the South Vietnamese government at any rate, found it impossible politically and psychologically to accept the terms of the agreement. The conflict resumed, but this time without the involvement of the United States. And after a few months, well, it ended with the result that we all know. And I'm not saying that events in Ukraine are going to follow this course, but if they do, I for one would not be surprised by it. Anyway, let's move on and let's just talk about other things, because over the last 24 hours, the evidence has come together that the Starmer's coalition of the willing, his ideas of getting a peacekeeping force into Ukraine, led by Macron and himself, is now very close to biting the dust. There's an article which appeared yesterday in the Daily Telegraph, which clearly comes from sources within the British military, which basically trashes this entire proposal. And it's written in the most, well, for the Daily Telegraph, most strongest possible terms. Starmer's Ukraine peacekeeping plan dismissed as political theatre. Doubts raised over coalition of the willing ambitions as UK and French military chiefs meet in Whitehall. And we are told that Keir Starmer's plan for coalition of the willing to keep the peace in Ukraine has been dismissed as political theatre. The few concrete details of what troops and equipment would be sent have emerged. On Sunday, senior military sources dismissed the plans, Sunday's presumably today, telling the Telegraph that Sir Keir has got ahead of himself. Earlier this weekend, Donald Trump's special envoy dismissed the plans as a posture and a pose. I discussed that all yesterday. It then goes on to say one senior army source, this is British Army source, said it was not remotely possible for a plan of support for Ukraine to be drawn up in time. The time is late April, when, according to some reports, the United States would like to see the ceasefire in Ukraine come into effect. Though even the US appears to accept that it may take a lot longer than that. And I personally don't think too much should be made of that timetable. And then the same source said there is no defined military end state or military strategic planning assumptions. It is all political theatre. Starmer got ahead of himself with talk of boots on the ground before he knew what he was talking about, which is why we hear less about it now and more about jets and vessels, which are easier to do and don't need basing in Ukraine. And we're then told that then there's a revival of this business about fighter jets and effectively no-fly zones. But even that, apparently, even those talks, one defence source described the talks even about that as being in their early stages, adding that they were as much about the 30 nations involved getting to know each other. It's politics, one military source said. There's no military sense in it. Neither the Russians nor the Americans supported the coalition, which has been led by the UK, and cautioned that the coalition's talks were complicated by the fact that no one knows what the mission is. There are about 700,000 Russians in and around Ukraine and over 1 million Ukrainians under arms. What is a 10,000-man international force based in the west of the country, over 400 kilometers from the front line, meant to do? It cannot even protect itself. What is the mission? What is its legitimacy? What are the rules of engagement? How is it commanded, supplied and housed? How long is it there for and why? No one knows. And then you have what the British like to call damning with faint praise. Another defence source said that Starmer was leading from the front. The Prime Minister himself went to headquarters 3 days ago to receive detailed secret briefings on operational planning for the coalition. There is respect across UK defence and our allies for his hard work and the hard work of our military in developing what are already comprehensive plans to secure a peace in Ukraine. Now, I'm going to suggest that that is British civil servant speak for telling Starmer, mind your own business. When people say that the minister is engaged in hard work, translated into ordinary English, that is what it usually means. It means that Starmer doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. He's coming along and coming up with all these ideas, and they are completely unrealisable. Well, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but that's certainly what it would have meant when I was working on the fringes of government. And anyway, that, it seems to me, is it. The European allies aren't keen. The Italians, as I said, have ruled themselves out. So it seems to the Spanish. The Poles categorically have. The Czech Republic, President Pavel, says that, well, the reality is that Ukraine can't win the war. That became obvious after the failure of a 2023 offensive. But yes, the Czech Republic would be willing to do something to support this project. It's typical President Pavel. He wants to have it both ways, in other words. So that was President Pavel. But we see that the military itself is dead against this idea. And they're now starting to brief the media about this. And I'm going to make my own guess, which is that with all of this negative briefing appearing in the media, with Starmer's own position, political position now, being increasingly questioned, his decision to cut £5 billion from the disability benefit budget has gone down very badly with Labour supporters, including many Labour MPs, and is being strongly criticised by the one newspaper, The Guardian, which has been reliably supportive of him. I just don't think this is going to happen. It makes little sense Witkoff spoke yesterday about how it was a posture and a pose, and he's absolutely right. Trump himself ridiculed it when he asked Starmer the rhetorical question, can you fight the Russians by yourself? The answer, of course, is no. This was always an extremely bad idea, and it isn't going to fly. Now, that brings us back to the question of why it was proposed at all. And, well, you can come up with all sorts of reasons and explanations connected to the Ukrainian crisis itself, the attempt to prolong the crisis, to outmaneuver Trump, to do all of those things. And I've discussed all of that in previous programs, and I'm not going to go back on any of that. In programs Alex Christoforou and I have done for the Duran, we've also made the point, which I think is absolutely true, that this is also Starmer's own way of involving Britain again closely in European affairs, getting very close to the European leadership, or at least to Emmanuel Macron, and to the leadership of the Central European institutions, Ursula von der Leyen and President Costa. I think there's something else here as well, which is that Starmer became Prime Minister of Britain, just under a year ago, without any very clear plan about what to do. He then discovered that there are a host of incredibly difficult and even intractable problems which any British Prime Minister who wants to make the situation in Britain for the British people better immediately faces. He has no real idea or plan how to deal with those problems. He seems to be keen to avoid a crisis on the bond markets. He doesn't want the same thing to happen to him that happened to Liz Truss when she was Prime Minister, when there was a massive sellout of British bonds, government bonds, and a crisis in the exchange rate of the pound. He wants to keep the situation stable to that extent. And that's one reason why he's carrying out all of these cuts to public spending. He understands that raising taxes is going to be very unpopular with many of the very powerful people in Britain, with what is often called in Britain Middle England, the British middle class, who are already very heavily taxed. So he's not prepared to do that. And the result is that he has no real plan and idea of how to take things forward. And it often happens with people with limited drive and, shall we say, intellect. I'm being kind. He retreats into territory where it is easier for him to maintain the illusion of control. I've seen that happen many times in the world of business, law, other such places, and you find it also in politics. The leaders who find it beyond their ability to wrestle with the urgent and pressing and seemingly insurmountable domestic problems which press around them, basically turn their backs on those problems and retreat into a world of playing the world statesman, conducting foreign policy, doing all of those things, and keeping themselves busy with ideas like this one, ideas of sending a peacekeeping force to Ukraine. I can think of many leaders who've done that in the past, and I think that that's quite possibly what we're seeing with Keir Starmer. This is something he can do. It doesn't have immediate political consequences. It keeps him in the newspapers. It gives him some positive publicity. It's popular with the part of the British political class that continues to remain deeply committed to Project Ukraine. It's popular with that part of the British electorate that hates Donald Trump and wants to see the British Prime Minister do things that appear to contradict Trump's policy. And the fact that it is utterly meaningless, that it is all a posture, that it is, as this article in the Daily Telegraph rather unkindly says, all political theatre, for the leader himself doesn't matter, because emotionally it protects him. Now, leaders who do this, who retreat into this kind of world, detached from many of the realities around them, tend to have a fairly short shelf life. There's already murmurings in Britain that might be true of Starmer himself. It's not as if there isn't opposition. And there was a very interesting report earlier today that the two most effective figures in the Brexit movement, Nigel Farage and Dominic Cummings, leaders of rival Brexit campaigns in the 2016 Brexit referendum, and people who historically have not been at all friends, have now had a meeting and appear to be thinking of working alongside each other. This could be quite an important development. Anyway, it's not as if Starmer won't face political challenges going forward. The Conservative Party, the traditional opposition, it must be said, is broken. But there are other political forces starting to emerge. But for the meantime, Starmer can indulge himself in these games of political theatre and tell himself that he's doing something important and useful, even if in reality he's doing no such thing. Now, that's Starmer. Elsewhere in the world, things continue to happen, not just in Ukraine. There's very disturbing information coming about the situation in the Middle East. Apparently there's reports that the Israeli cabinet is now thinking of restarting the ground war in Gaza and of annexing territory in Gaza into Israel itself, and of once again engaging in an all-out ground war to destroy Hamas, something which of course they've been trying to do for more than a year without any success up to now, but maybe they're about to try again. Anyway, there's a lot of talk about that. There's also some very worrying reports which I've seen coming out of the United States itself, from the administration, that one official apparently has said that the American objective is to stand by Israel no matter what, and that the plan is to basically to destroy all Israel's opponents, leaving Israel not just secure, but dominant in the region. If that kind of agenda is being followed, then frankly, we are going to look at an explosion in the Middle East on a scale beyond anything we've ever seen. So there is lots of disturbing and worrying things going on. And in Europe, meanwhile, gas reserves, as I've discussed in recent programs, have fallen again. to below critical levels for this time of the year. It's astonishing to me how little reporting there is of this. Anyway, we will see where all this goes. But in the meantime, the discussions in Riyadh continue. The war in Ukraine itself continues. There's still apparently those Ukrainian troops trapped in Kiev, running out of food and supplies, or perhaps almost out of food and supplies. There's also reports of further Russian advances in other places, especially in Zaporozhye region and western Donbass. There was a long report in Riyadh which appeared to suggest that the Russians do indeed now have plans to capture the town of Orekhov. Well, we shall see. Belousov, the Russian defense minister, is supposed to have briefed Putin about a major offensive which is coming. I think both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, in military terms, it's the quiet before the storm. At least in Ukraine, with the conflict in Ukraine, there is a process underway to settle the conflict, which I think and believe will eventually come to something. In the Middle East, well, there's very few reasons to hope, and the situation gets darker and grimmer. Well, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More for me soon. Have a very good day.